The dietary laws. 1. The laws of unclean foods are given in Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14. 2. The laws against eating blood are in Leviticus 19:26, Deuteronomy 12:23, 15:23, Leviticus 17:10-14. 3. Sacrificial meat permitted to the worshipper can only be eaten on the first 2 days after being offered and sacrificed. Leviticus 19:5-8, 7:15-19. 2. Neither fat nor blood can be eaten. Leviticus 3:17, 7:23-27. 5. No clean animal killed or torn by wild animals is to be eaten. It is to be given to the dogs. Exodus 22:31, Leviticus 7:24, 17:15, 22:8, Deuteronomy 14:21. Over the years, I have seen considerable evidence of the rage of unbelievers against God's laws governing sexuality. Sex, for the humanists, is the area of freedom. Even men who are personally revolted at homosexuality will defend it as a major human right. For them, man, not God, must determine the use of one's sexuality. For churchmen, a key area of resentment is a restriction on diet. The dietary laws are for them what God calls the forbidden foods, an abomination. Hang on, didn't quite hit that right, did I? The dietary laws are for them what God calls the forbidden foods, an abomination. Although obedience to the dietary laws during the course of church history has been more extensive than realized, opposition to them has been intense. St. Gregory of Nyssa, circa 335 to circa 395 AD, turned all the laws of God into allegories, as he did also. No. Try again. Hang on a second. Try again. No, not you. Go away. Why you don't go away, man? St. Gregory of Nyssa, circa 335 to circa 395 AD, turned all the laws of God into allegories, as he did also biblical history. His status as a saint is good evidence of the Church's fallibility. Gregory held it to be unworthy of God to be concerned about foods, or law and history for that matter. To be concerned about foods, or law and history for that matter. According to Gregory, quote, "The law does not instruct us how to eat. Nature, which implants a desire for food in us, is a sufficient lawgiver with regard to these things." End quote. The Church is still full of men like Gregory, profoundly convinced of their saintliness as they rise above any need to heed God's laws concerning diet. Some have said that the concerns over such laws on my part are evidences of my lack of scholarly abilities. Well, faithfulness to God is for me the prized ability. These laws are the laws of life. We are summoned to choose life or death. Of course, we do have the super pious who are troubled over the necessity to eat and drink, urinate and defecate. One quote-unquote holy woman once remarked, or so it was reported to me, that she could not understand why God inflicted us with these bodily functions. He did so because he made us to be creatures, not co-gods. The dietary laws are reminders that we are creatures, if we need reminding. They tell us that the totality of our lives are to be governed by God and His Word. It is the tempter who tells man, "Ye shall be as God," Genesis 3:5, and it is the essence of sin to revolt against creatureliness. My mouth is giving way. and it is the essence of sin to revolt against creatureliness. Those whose spirituality lifts them above the dietary laws are too spiritual for the God of the Bible. God gives us guidelines to make life simpler and better for us, but we like to complicate. God gives us guidelines to make life simpler and better for us, but we like to complicate everything and then whine about it. If you don't like the dietary laws, perhaps you don't like the God who gave them.
That's racist. Why you been so racist, man? With your law and I'm racist. Y'all be racist, you hear?
All right, here we be, chapter 31. Chapter 31. Gossip and speech. Gossip and false report are classified as false witness or being an unrighteous witness. Exodus 23, 1 and 2, Leviticus 19:16, Deuteronomy 22, 13 to 21. The references to Exodus 23, 1 and 2 and Deuteronomy 22, 13 to 21 have in mind a legal proceeding, although the case in Deuteronomy 22, 13 to 21 begins as slander and becomes then legal action. Leviticus 19:16 refers to gossip. It is equated with taking a stand against a neighbour's life, and it is a very serious matter. If one man assaults another... Hang on, I can't do that. I have to do it right. It is equated with taking a stand against a neighbour's life and is a very serious matter. If one man assaults another, usually the bruises heal in a short time, but if he slanders his neighbour, the stain and hurt linger on. Hence it is that God so strongly stresses care in speech. In the Ten Commandments, the statement reads, "Neither shalt thou bear false witness against thy neighbour," Deuteronomy 5:20. The primary reference is to a court of law, but this does not exclude the court of life, where we continually bear witness before the Lord. In the Sermon on the Mount, our Lord tells us, "But let your word yes be yes, and your no be no." I'm thinking of Bob Marley, not the Bible. "And your no, no. Anything beyond this is from the evil one." Matthew 5:37, Berkeley version. He plainly connects gossip and trivializing speech as satanic in inspiration, a very serious classification. The scriptures have much to say on speech. Paul in Colossians 4:6 declares, quote, "Let your speech be always with grace, seasoned with salt, that ye may know how ye ought to answer every man." Paul here speaks of the fact that a Christian may be attacked because of his faith. To answer all critics, one's speech should be seasoned with salt, then an idiom for being intelligent and governed by wit rather than anger. Above all, one should always be governed by grace in speaking. James 3, 1-18 is a strong statement about the menace of an unruly tongue governed by malice and sin. In brief, speech is a serious matter. Grade A. All right. Pardon me. All right, so we're on chapter 32. When we get this, we'll be at the halfway point as enumerated by chapters. Chapter 32. The Covenant Law. T.R. Hobbes has said of law in the Bible, quote, "All law presupposes the existence and identity of Israel's God Yahweh as the deliverer from Egypt." End quote. The New Testament stresses the continuity with this in Matthew 5:17-20. Salvation is now more explicit. It is atonement, but the law as the way of life for the redeemed remains. Law-breaking is, quote, a refusal to live within the relationship established by the covenant, end quote. In other words, to reject the law of God is to reject the covenant and the covenant God in favour of an idol, a God created by man's imagination. Man's relationship to God is covenantal, and to attempt a direct relationship is to supplant Jesus Christ as mediator. Antinomians are implicitly replacing Christ with themselves. Antinomians replace Jesus Christ with themselves. The word covenant is not in their vocabulary, although one at times can hear some speak of a very personal covenant with God, as though none other could exist. A covenant between God and man is between a greater and a lesser party. In any such covenant, for the greater to enter into a covenant with a lesser party is an act of grace, so that a covenant by God with man is an act of sovereign and uncaused grace. But a covenant is a treaty of law given by the greater, here by God, to the lesser man as the way of life. God gives. God gives his law to man as an act of grace so that man may have life rather than death. A covenant is thus both grace and law when between God and man, as we see it in the Bible. It is a thoroughly relevant It is a thoroughly relevant fact given to determine what man's way of life should be under God. God's covenant is life, and the alternative is death. But there's more. Man's life is on God's earth, and God's covenant is a covenant of grant, and as such it involves two things, a gift of land and a status as the great king's or God's man. This kind of lord and client status existed in the medieval era. God requires obedience, honour, and exclusive worship. Worship can be defined as obedience, faithfulness, service, fear, love, and full commitment to the covenant Lord. In Deuteronomy 5:6-10, this requirement is clearly set forth. I am the Lord thy God, which brought thee out of the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage. Thou shalt have none other gods before me. Thou shalt not make thee any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in the heaven above. Do it right. Any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the waters beneath the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself unto them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments. First of all, God requires obedience to his law because, apart from the fact that he is our Creator, he is also our Redeemer. We owe him obedience now and forever. Second, this means, quote, Thou shalt have none other gods before me. Nothing else can have priority in our life. God alone is God, and God alone can be our God. Third, no graven image, whether the work of our hands or of our minds, can command our loyalty and worship. Today, many of our graven images are intellectual or institutional. As Ellen Stang wrote, quote, Thou shalt have none other gods before me, including the state, end quote. Fourth, God is a jealous God. He requires exclusive worship. To give priority to anything else in our lives other than God is to deny him. Fifth, God is immersive. I stuttered. I can't believe it. What is that? I don't think it was a stutter. Fifth, God is a merciful God whose mercy extends down the generations to those who love him. Sixth, God keeps his word. This is a great and encouraging fact, but also a terrifying one. God is not careless about records as we are. Is not careless about records. Okay, got it. God is not careless about records as we are, nor heedless or forgetful of what He's promised. Law-keeping, life within the covenant, is living within the framework of God's covenant law. It means recognizing that we do not determine what our goodness consists of, but that God and His law determine. He is the Lord, and all judgment rightfully belongs to Him. It's always necessary to remember that the law of God, the law, it is always necessary to remember that the law is God's covenant law, given to us as an act of grace. Our response to grace, or the law given by grace, is not one of merit, but of gratitude. For this reason, the Psalms strongly stress praise, thanksgiving, and gratitude as basic to our worship of God. All right, we're motoring on okay here. We're motoring on okay. Ook-a-dook. Chapter 33. Law as Warfare. In Genesis 3:5, we encounter the tempter's plan for mankind. Every man as his own God, knowing or determining for himself what is good and evil, law and morality. This temptation is called original sin because, first, at the heart of all sin is the creature's will to be his own God and therefore determining for himself what constitutes good and evil. Second, it's called original sin because it is the first and key sin, the root of man's revolt against God. The fall of man is into this insistence on making all sin simply a relative matter, a question of personal choice, not of ultimate good and evil. This view has been made a matter of education's priority in our time. Most notably in the 1980s and 1990s, state schools, which, barring biblical teaching, have insisted in values clarification teaching that morality does not deal with absolute good and evil, but with purely personal and relative choices. Thus, it is held homosexuality. Thus, it is held. Thus, it's held homosexuality. Thus, it is held homosexuality may be a good choice for one person, but not another. Judgmentalism must be avoided, it's held, because morality is a matter of a personal lifestyle. Such a perspective is simply a present-day statement of Genesis 3:5, and it is basic to modern education. It is an ancient heresy. Marcion's good God was superior because he was not judgmental, and and he was against law. Sorry, eh? And he was against law, in particular the law of the Bible and the Bible's God. A long-standing vein of Gnosticism within the Church has held to this antinomianism. It has replaced the antithesis between good and evil with the neo-Manichaean antithesis between spirit and matter. It has therefore affirmed antinomianism and transformed Christianity into another religion. But the holy warfare of Scripture is not between spirit and matter. After all, Satan and his fallen angels are purely spiritual beings and yet totally evil. The holy warfare is a moral war, and the premise of the legions of God is the law of God. God's law tells us that good and evil are not relativistic terms, but basic ones that describe and set forth a fundamental and unchanging difference. The good expresses God's holiness, righteousness or justice, knowledge and dominion. These are communicable attributes of God. Communicable. These are communicable attributes of God which man must emulate, and this is done by obeying the law of God. The law of God tells us of his nature, so that we know God truly, though not exhaustively, in his law and his works. In a college textbook on sexual choices, it is held that, quote, self-respect and wholeness, end quote, should guide our, quote, moral, end quote, decisions. Our choices should be personal, not social, and these imperatives should guide our personal choices. Equality, responsibility, and honesty. This means that objective and absolute standards are denied in favour of personal ones. Of course, this quote-unquote free and quote-unquote liberated sexuality is not free from the basic premise it wars against, biblical morality. It regards God's moral law as the implicit or explicit enemy, and it has its own version of the holy war. Man, to be free, must wage war against God and his repressive, quote-unquote, repressive laws. All law is a form of warfare, including humanistic laws. Speed limits war against all who drive too fast or too recklessly. Failure to pay taxes is seen as an attack on the state's life and is severely punished. The state must have laws or go out of existence, and the life of the state depends on the peoples. The people. And the life of the state depends on the people's obedience to the state and its laws. God's law defends God's order. God's law sets forth God's justice, and obedience to it is necessary to love and serve. God's law sets forth God's justice, and obedience to it is necessary to the love and service of God. God's law tells us that there is a good and evil, and the Ten Commandments give us a summary of the law. The Sermon on the Mount defines the holy war more closely, and it requires our full obedience in word, thought, and deed. The difference between good and evil is not determined by man, nor by how certain acts affect us, but by the absolute and perfect being of God. The premise for our obedience is given in Deuteronomy 6:4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. There's a fundamental and total unity of being in the Godhead, no division, no disunity, and no conflict. When he speaks in and through his law, he gives us an undivided word and an unchanging requirement. God declares, I am the Lord, I change not, Malachi 3:6, which means that, because he is unchanging, so too is his law. Change and decay mark men and their ideas and works, but never God. Life is a constant warfare. Men are at war with their past and present, and with one another. The world is not perfect, and they seek to change it to match their ideas of perfection. Their ideas of perfection. The world is not perfect, and they seek to change it to match their ideas of perfection. From the Christian perspective, the world is sinful and fallen and needs redemption and change. Redemption by Christ's atonement, and then change to conform to his law or justice. The new creation does not abolish God's law any more than it sets aside the atonement. In the new creation, the atoned live in the perfect justice or righteousness of God. The antinomians who insist that they are not bound by God's law do not say the same about the state's law. They obey it, and in so doing, they unite with the chief priests who said about Jesus, "We have no king but Caesar," John 19:15. Which of these antinomians would welcome it if their children insisted that they were not bound by their parents' word? Or insisted it was enough to love their parents, and that an insistence on obedience is legalism? Too much thinking in the church today is childish. It is resentful of any insistence on biblical standards, and it is eclectic, picking and choosing from the Bible as though from a buffet table. But such a perspective is an insistence on man's autonomy from God. If we practice the tempter's premise of Genesis 3:5 and insist on being our own God, it will not commend us to God if we at times use His word to buttress our word and our independence. As Cornelius Van Til stated it, the choice is between autonomy, self-law, and theonomy, God's law. Okay, this is the time where I say, if you like this, you want to support the work here, you can do so, no problemo, by liking, sharing, commenting, messaging.
Saying, oh, good work job there, man.
If you really want to help me do more better work, more better, with more better equipment, more better training, more better stuff, or just want to show your appreciation, you can go to nathanteacher.com and click on the donate button where you can make a one-off or regular donation via the PayPal. Mokele. All right. Okay, so we've reached the halfway. Oh, no, we're past the halfway mark as denominated by chapters, but by no means denominated by actual stuff, unless there's an index, a huge index, which there may well be. Chapter 34, Sin. Ernest F. Kevin pointed out some years ago that God's law defines sin. It follows, therefore, quote, if there is sin, there also must be law, for sin is transgression of law, 1 John 3:4, end quote. God's law is much more than a legal code. It is covenantal law. It establishes a personal relationship between God and man. For this reason, disobedience to God's law is regarded by the prophets as adultery, as a betrayal of a close union. It is thus much more than breaking a law or violating a statute. It is the most fundamental kind of disloyalty one can commit. It is a personal affront to God the Lord, a betrayal precisely where the most intense loyalty should exist. The biblical Hebrew word hesed means loyal kindness, loving kindness, and even love. Chesed presuppose chesed. I'm guessing it's. Chesed presupposes the covenant, a relationship where man should manifest the most intense kind of loyalty. The word occurs 128 times in the Psalms. Quote, no, yes. Is that a quote or not? Let me check. Yeah, it's a quote.
It's sometimes hard to tell if quote or not. Quote.
Quote, Chesed is eternal. Psalm 105, 106, 117, 135. Characterized by fidelity. Psalm 84:11, 88, 137:8. Immensity. Psalm 32, 35:6, 56:11, 102:11, 107:5. Fullness. Psalm 35:6-11. And reveals God's beneficent saving spirit. Psalm 6:5, 30:17, 53. Psalm 97:2-3, which, quote, hails the saving quality of Hesed, end quote, is, quote, the liturgy's Christmas song. The liturgy's Christmas song to celebrate the birth of Jesus, which means Saviour, end quote. In addition, the divine Chesed is marked by humility of love, quote, which stoops to equality with his beloved and even to the lower self-abasement of the, quote, form of a slave, end quote, Philippians 2:7, end quote. Consequently, God showers his Chesed upon the poor and humble, Psalm 67 and 71. The omnipotent power and justice that mark God's Chesed, Psalm 61:12 following, make it possible for God to give victory to the weak and poor and to laugh at the futility of creature self-exalt. Okay, that's a bit unusual. And to laugh at the futility of creature self-exaltation, Psalm 2, 36:13, etc. Simultaneously, God is quick to pardon, Psalm 29:6, end quote. Chesed on the part of man means faithfulness of men one to another and towards God. It means the knowledge of God and the fear of God. It means, quote, religiosity, piety, kindness and love of mankind, end quote. It means mercy and compassion and more because it expressed a loyalty to the covenant and it is an expression of covenant life. On God's part, Chesed expresses his covenant fellowship. It expresses his covenant grace in helping us. In Micah 6:8, God's primary requirement of man, in Moffat's rendering, is, quote, to be just and kind and live in quiet fellowship with your God, end quote. This is, quote, God's first inescapable requirement that the Israelites do, quote, justice, end quote. Hebrew mishpat, a common term for the legal norms demanded by the covenant. The second requirement of Micah 6:8 is to love mercy, or to be kind, that is, chesed. The curses pronounced in the Bible are for contempt for and disregard of God's law. One does not escape the curses by denying the law that proclaims them. Pietism has tended to reduce God's relationship to mankind to a non-covenantal and purely personal one. Abraham knew better. In Genesis 18:17 following, God tells Abraham of the impending judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah for their...
Lovey-de-love, lovey-de-love, lovey-de-love.
God tells Abraham of the impending judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah for their wickedness. This Abraham does not deny. His concern is with the innocent. Will they also be judged? God answers Abraham saying that he will spare Sodom if 10 righteous men can be found. Judgment must come, but a righteous element upholding justice can avert it. Responsibility is not purely personal. We have a responsibility to the country and the place of our residence. The law speaks to our total life. Thus, in Deuteronomy 20, I make sound with thumb. No good. Thus, in Deuteronomy 21, 1-9, Halabajobo. Thus, in Deuteronomy 21, 1-9, we have a law regarding a murdered man found in a field. The city closest to the dead man must assume responsibility for his death. If the murderer cannot be found, then a heifer must be sacrificed to make atonement for the unsolved murder. In other words, every wrong must be righted. If not on earth, then God, in his judgments in history and at the last judgment, will complete the righting of all wrongs. What this tells us about sin is that it is a very personal affront to the triune God. An impersonal status law is constantly broken, often with impunity, and the many violations are in time forgotten because perfect enforcement is not even dreamed. God's law presupposes full and perfect enforcement. What God does not complete in time and history is enforced in hell. The necessary requirement of justice is restitution, recompense, repayment. Disbelief in hell means in time a disbelief in justice and a pessimism with regard to history. God's covenant with man is not only a gift of law, but a gift of land. Tenure on land is normally in return for covenantal obedience. Thus, to despise and disobey God's law is an invitation to displacement and captivity. Associated with this is God's curse upon covenant breakers by means of bad weather and natural disasters, drought, flood, earthquake, etc., and by means of an inflicted judicial blindness. Blindness to God's law is blindness to reality. Holy smokes, that was great. Oh, that's good, eh? All right, folks. Well, thanks for tuning in. It's been a pleasure. I hope it was fun for thee as well. And yeah, we're over the halfway mark. Maybe not. You never know. So hope to see you in chapter